Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me is Phil Mackintosh, chief economist at Nasdaq, for an update on the latest COVID-19 news, the U.S. and global economies, as investors and people are working their way back to work. And Phil, we're here today to discuss consumer attitudes towards reopening the economy and social distancing, because that's really going to impact employment data and American businesses going forward.
Yeah, I mean, the data that we got last week was, as a lot of people have said, off the charts. And a lot of the data we've been looking at lately is off the charts. I think some of the really good news on the data on unemployment was that people generally have temporary layoffs, not which in theory is correct. And that's what we're hoping for, is that this is a very short, sharp stay-at-home mandate and everybody gets back to work pretty quickly. But that's also important for the GDP hit, because if we're only unemployed to this level for a month, it's the year, and it's really not going to be anywhere near as impactful as some of the other recessions we've seen in the past. And so although we're looking at charts that show the level of layoffs and the level of unemployment at century records, hopefully it's the shortest recession that we've ever had, and it's not that big an impact in GDP when we get to the end of the year.
Yeah, and if we take a look at our second set of slides here today, getting back to work and what that looks like for the U.S., for Sweden, for Germany, with countries that are starting to reopen.
Yeah, I mean, completely different scenarios here too. You've got the USA, which is slowly getting its caseload under control. And as we've talked about before, there's regions where cases are growing. There's regions like Seattle and New York and New Jersey now that have basically got their cases under control. A lot more. But you can see even within Europe, Sweden's well known because it's had a pretty laissez-faire attitude of, be sensible without doing lockdowns. And even they have managed to get cases under control, although a lot slower than other countries in Europe like Germany that did lockdowns really quickly and pretty aggressively, Italy as well. The interesting thing is Germany started to open back in April 20, and you can see a little bit of a pickup there in their May cases right at the bottom of the chart. So that's not great news, but it doesn't look like it's a reacceleration at this stage, which is good news for anyone trying to reopen their economy. And so I know the US has plans to start opening different states starting this week. A lot of the worst affected states starting in June. The UK announced plans to start to reopen today. European countries that haven't already started to reopen are reopening today. And that's great news for whether people can get back to work and how quickly they can get back to work. I think the next question after that is, it's going to be a lot harder to restart the economy than it was to shut it down. There's going to be specific industries where people don't want to go back and spend at or go back and visit, even if they're told that everything's open like normal. And so that's going to be a little bit harder to judge, and it's going to make it a little bit longer to get everything back to normal.
All right, well, let's take a look at some of the health and geopolitics behind this, because now we're starting to hear about Kawasaki disease increasing in kids, and U.S.-China rhetoric is heating up again.
Yeah, and I think, obviously the market's down a little bit today, and those are two of the factors that have come up over the weekend that are negatives for the market. The Kawasaki disease, it doesn't seem to affect heaps of kids, but it's, being a parent myself, one of the things you really worry about is keeping your family healthy and keeping your kid healthy. And Kawasaki disease is potentially being triggered by COVID. So even though kids don't seem to be that badly affected by COVID themselves, Kawasaki disease, which is the partly the reaction that the body has in the immune system, but it's a little bit debilitating, and it's actually caused some fatalities. So that's scary for parents. It's also a problem because some of the unemployment is in schools where teachers have been furloughed. And the hope was, in a lot of places, and a lot of countries are already doing this, is to get kids back to school so the parents can get back to work. Will not only re-employ the teachers, but it'll let the parents actually go back to real work. And if kids are being affected by this, that's going to make it even harder to get things restarted. Obviously, there's plenty of dimensions to the US-China rhetoric. We had the trade war before all this happened. In the most recent weeks, we've had the US-China for leaking the virus out of a bio facility. And now we've got stories about whether they're potentially stealing some of our vaccine research. So it doesn't stop, and it helped a political solution, which needs to be a global solution, really, to the coronavirus.
Yeah, and then also you brought up a great point too, that there's over 4 million global cases approaching nearly 300,000 deaths. It's a pretty high mortality rate, but if we get more antibody tests revealing exactly how many people have it, that could make going back to work easier because these people in theory should be immune.
Yeah, I mean, this is the whole risk reward type of assessment of coronavirus. And the question is it as deadly as looks? And is it really the people that are protesting the severity of lockdowns in some states? Like, is it really the risk that we think? And at the top line, I mean, obviously the death rates are usually 2 to 3 weeks lagged on the cases as well. So in reality, that 7.5% rate, which is just simply dividing the deaths by the cases, is really high. It's close to what we saw with SARS and MERS, and it makes COVID look like a really significant health problem. But I think even in the States, we know that people that were symptomatic but weren't that sick were actually asked back when the testing was quite hard to get, just to go home and stay home unless things got worse. So there's bound to be a bunch of people that have actually had COVID, have been sent home with it, maybe now have recovered. And if that means that there's way more than 4 million global cases, then the mortality rate goes way down too. There's been some studies that suggest around about 10 times as many people might have actually had COVID than what we've seen from the testing so far. Sudden, your 7.5% mortality goes down to a much lower rate that might make it much less scary for us to go back and be at work and do some somewhat risky activities if the probability of that risk actually materializing in COVID was much lower than we thought.
All right, Phil, thank you so much for kicking off the week with us.
No worries. Thanks, Jill.
All right. And thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.